Thanks a lot for the opportunity to speak, and thanks to Brenda and Donovan and company for inviting me today. I've got slides here. I'm going to try and share my screen. Is that coming up there for you?
It is.
Oh, perfect. Thanks. For those of you who don't know who we are, our company, Quorum Corporation, has been monitoring the grain handling and transportation system in Western Canada for the last 21 years. We put out weekly, monthly, quarterly, and annual reports. You can find those on our website, which is www.grainmonitor.ca. And we also answer questions anytime you've got them. We're more than happy to help people out in understanding what it is we do. Our data is all on our website. So if you have any questions about the data that's there, again, I would encourage you to contact us or look on our website, and it can tell you all about the movement of grain in Western Canada. We track grain from the time it leaves the farm until it's loaded on a vessel or moved on a train to a destination in the United States. We track all Western Canadian grains moving out of the territory, and that includes the export grain to Eastern Canada and US and Mexico. Today, I'm going to talk to you about basically what happened in the last couple of years, and then I'll finish it off by talking about what could be the elephant in the room, and that's the status of the movement this year and the BC floods that we have recently experienced that have had quite an effect on the movement of just about everything, including grain. Just really quickly talking about last year, and I think last year is the good news story. We set records right across the board last year. 78.5 million tons was the highest or the largest crop I think that we've ever harvested. Not I think, it is the largest. And it was also the highest total movement of any kind of grain in the past ever at 63.6 million metric tons. Also a record in the number of port shipments or exports, which was 44.7 million tons loaded to vessels on Western Canadian ports. And we also saw some improvements in car cycle and the length of the vessel lineups and the time that they spent in port. So you can see on this graph, it shows you basically the last 22 years worth of production, and last year's production again hit that record in both production and in the total grain supply. And when we talk about grain supply, we're talking about the amount of grain that there is available to be sold or moved from Western Canada. The total movement last year, the vast majority of everything that moves goes to the Western Canadian ports. And in this case, it's the three Western ports: Vancouver, Thunder Bay, and Prince Rupert. There's also an increasing amount of traffic that's moving into the United States, 13% of it. Eastern Canada represents about 6%, and the Mexican side is about 1% at this point in time. It's up 5% from the previous year. Our port shipments, as you probably all know, Vancouver is the single largest port of export for Canadian grain, and remains so. And last year, again, another record at 31.3 million metric tons went through the port. Prince Rupert was down quite a bit at 4.9 million metric tons. Thunder Bay was also down a little bit at 8.3 million metric tons. And Churchill saw a slight movement at the beginning of the crop year at 0.09 million metric tons. The West Coast has really become the avenue of export for Western Canadian grain. And if you went back to the 1980s, Thunder Bay was the big port of export. And that was because a large amount of the grain that we were shipping offshore was destined to the former Soviet Union. Since that market is pretty much dried up and they've become self-sufficient in the grain that they grow, our markets have really shifted to the Asia Pacific markets. And that's why we see this huge increase in the volume of traffic that's moving out over the West Coast. It really works out to be about a 5-year annual growth rate of about 5%. And it also reflects the increased capacity at the new G3 terminal on Vancouver's North Shore and the Fraser Grain Terminal that was just recently opened on the Fraser River by a combined consortium of Parrish and Heimbecker and Grains Connect. So talking about what happened this year, again, everybody knows this was a short crop. We're at about 47 million tons of production. When you add in the carry forward stock of 7 million tons, it puts us at roughly 54 million tons worth of grain supply. We haven't seen a year like this since 2002. So the production was down 39% over last year and 36% over the 5-year average. We've had quite a run for the last 8 years of an excess of 60 million tons, and in some years 70 million tons, which pretty much established the new normal. So the drought this year has really affected the amount of grain that Canada has left to sell. And it wasn't specific to any one commodity group. The cereals were down 41%. The oilseed crops were down 34%. Special crops were down 29%. So just want to talk about the performance of the system really quickly. We really track a lot of the performance of the system. We don't just focus on railways, but railways ends up being a big part of our focus because they seem to have the greatest effect on the movement. And when you look at just the car cycles over the last 6 years, 7 years, you really start to see a trend. And the way that we look at it is in different components of the movement. And that's basically to see who has the possession of the grain and where is the problem lie. And what we found in our analysis consistently, especially over the last 5 years, is while the car cycle is starting to slightly decrease, essentially it's not the railway's time that's decreasing, because the shipper time, the amount of time that the shipper has it in its possession, meaning at the country elevator or at the port terminal, the time that they have it in their possession is actually decreased over that period by 21%, while the railway's time is actually up 30%. So that kind of points to us that there is an issue. And we have pointed this out in numerous different ways to the 2 different railways. Another thing that we get really concerned about is the amount of time that grain takes to move from the country to the port. And in this case, this is a total average of the 3 Western ports, or this is just, it's not a total of the 3 Western, this is Vancouver specifically because it is the biggest port. And you can see that the transit time over the last 4 years has steadily been increasing. And the other thing that we measure is the variability of that transit time. It allows the grain companies to be able to plan for the arrival of the grain for when the ship is ready to load. And that variable has actually increased as well over the last 4 years. In lay terms, basically what we're finding is that the variability of that movement is ranging anywhere between 25 and as much as 40%. So that's basically 7 or 8 days plus or minus 40%. And that makes it very, very difficult for the grain companies to try and schedule grain to a vessel. Another thing that we track is vessel performance. The vessel performance is measured in a few different ways, but probably most commonly is how many vessels are there waiting at any given point in time for a ship to arrive. And we've seen periods of time where the vessels lineup has exceeded 50 vessels. Now, if you go back to the 1920 crop year, we went through about a 3-month period of time where there was over 45 vessels sitting there. These last few months, that vessel lineup has really come down, and that's basically an association to the volume of grain that's been available to move. You can really see it there on the left-hand side graph where the blue bars are really starting to fall off, and that's basically about when the system started to run out of grain last year. And as we went into this crop year, it really started off really well. The vessel lineups on the West Coast were very, very small, very low. But as we got into the crop year, that vessel lineup started to really increase. Same thing in the 1920 crop year in terms of how long vessels sat in port. We were seeing some vessels out there that were in excess of 40 days. And these bars here actually show you what is the average time vessels spend in port. The 2020 crop year saw that number still stay really abnormally high, but as we got into this crop year into August and September, it was really coming down. Again, reflective of the size of the crop. The thing to keep in mind is that, and as anybody who's heard me talk before, when a grain company charters a vessel, they usually do it with the idea that they're going to have around 10 to 12 days to load the vessel. And anything that goes over and above that, they're paying demurrage on. Right now, vessels that are sitting in port are charging demurrage at a rate of about $30,000 a day. And we've got some vessels out there right now that have been there in excess of 45 days. So that's a lot of money. And ultimately, that money ends up getting reflected back into the price that you guys pay. So as is with everything else in the grain business, ultimately, the cost comes out of the farmer's pocket. And that's why it concerns us. So last year, what we were seeing was an average of about 17.5 days. So that means on average, every ship was paying about 5.5 days or more in demurrage, which is a fair bit of money. And the reason those vessels are waiting is because they're sitting there waiting for the railways to bring the grain, bottom line. So when you look at this graph, what we've done is a fair bit of analysis, and what we're looking for is a cause and effect. And the causal relationship becomes very, very stark in this. And I know it's a complicated graph, but if you look at the blue lines, those represent what the vessel lineup is out in the West Coast. The black line is the order fulfillment rate. Now, the Ag Transport Coalition does a weekly measure of how much the railways have provided insofar as car capacity is to the elevator system. And basically what we're seeing is the causal relationship is when the order fulfillment rates really start to fall, the vessel lineups start to climb. The red bars represent another measure that we track with the grain terminals at the ports. What we have is a measure where the terminals report to us on a weekly basis how many hours they were operating unloading cars, and how many hours were they operating without any cars to unload. In other words, all of the people that they've got staffed in the terminals to unload cars don't have anything to do. And again, you can see the causal relationship there is that when they don't have any cars, the vessel lineup goes up. So someone may ask, how do we know that the reason is that the vessel lineup increases and the vessel time in port increases? It's because the railways have not been bringing the grain to the port. So moving forward, I just want to talk a little bit about some of the changes that we've seen in the infrastructure in the system, country and in the terminal. And I also want to talk about loop tracks and what kind of effect that they've had on the movement of grain. So first and foremost, you can basically see that what's happened with the terminal facilities is in respect to the number of facilities that are out there and the storage availability, there hasn't been a significant change insofar as the physical infrastructure. We've added a couple of terminals out in Vancouver, and of course their storage capacity has increased. In the country, over the last 22 years, you can really see a marked change where the number of conventional elevators are just, very quickly disappearing. In the early part of the 2000s, that decrease was rapid. But when you take a look at it from a storage perspective, we're kind of into a new era right now, and that is the advent of the loop track facilities that are out in the country, and they're having fairly significant impact on the productivity of the system and the productivity of the railways. If you take a look at this graph here, what this shows is in the gray bars is the number of cars that we're seeing flowing through into Vancouver by both railways into the system that are originating on a loop track. And that, beginning in about March, April of 2020, we started to see this rapid increase. And that's basically when the G3 terminal opened in Vancouver. So what that actually did is that any kind of car that originated on a loop track, you can see in the red line in that graph, that car cycle really started to decrease. It went from a high of over 20 days all the way down to an average that we were seeing towards the end of the crop year of at about 9 to 9.5 days, which is a significant decrease in the time that it takes to move cars. And you see in the blue line, that's basically the trajectory of the average car cycle, running anywhere between 15 and 17 days. And this is an average of both of the railways' car cycle times. So it basically tells us two things. Number one is that the loop tracks are actually having an increased improvement in the cycle times of cars. It also probably suggests that the railways are giving a little bit more preference to cars that either originated off a loop track or are destined to a loop track. And that's because it becomes a lot more efficient for them. They can reduce the car cycle and they get better asset utilization out of both their rail cars and out of their locomotive power. A lot of this also has to do, and I don't have a slide on it, but the new cars that have been coming out, and there's now almost 6,000 of them out there, are much shorter. They have a higher capacity by comparison to the old government fleet, which had an average capacity of anywhere between 89 and 91 tons per car. These new cars can handle up to 105 tons per car. They're shorter, so you can put more cars in a train. So they give the railways a lot more efficiency than what they had before. I just wanted to talk really quickly about the Vancouver terminal throughput capacity. The Vancouver terminal, with the addition of two new grain terminals, plus the fact that almost every terminal out there has done things to increase its throughput capacity, has really seen its throughput capacity between 2015 and 2021 increase from 30 million tons annually to almost 50 million tons. And that's an optimal unrestricted capacity. In terms of what their real operating capacity is, they've added almost 15 million tons worth of capacity out in the West Coast. So I don't think at any time in the near future, Vancouver is going to run out of capacity. They're very, very well structured at this point in time to handle as much grain as we can actually produce or ship through there for the foreseeable future. Just want to talk about one little issue that is kind of still looming in the background, and that is the amount of anchorage space that there is out in Vancouver. Because it is our most important port, and it's in particular most important for producers in Saskatchewan and Alberta, the amount of anchorage space out there becomes very important, because when they run out of anchorage space, that means we've got some big problems in the total grain handling and transportation system. They regularly occupy over half of the anchorages in English Bay in a normal year. This year isn't a normal year, by the way, but that trend has continued to increase all the way up to the end of the last crop year. So when they run out of space in English Bay, they start to park those vessels in anchorages that are along Vancouver Island, all the way from Sydney, BC, all the way up to north of Nanaimo. And the people out there don't like it. And so one of the members of parliament on Vancouver Island actually put forward a private member's bill to reduce the number of anchorages to about 30% of what they are. And if that happened, that would be a very, very big issue, not just for the grain industry, but for all bulk exports off the West Coast. Now, with calling the election, basically that private member's bill died on the order paper, but I think most people expect that something a lot like it or the same one is going to be retabled again. And this is going to become a big issue. I don't have a suggestion how to fix it. The Port of Vancouver has been working on some solutions, but at the end of the day, that could have a big effect on the export of Canadian products, most particularly grain. Some other issues that we see coming up, that's just basically a map that shows you where all of the different anchorages are on the West Coast and where they are in English Bay and in the Burrard Inlet. Moving along, talking about this year, you can see some pictures up there on this slide of some of the damage that was incurred in the flooding and the incredible rainfall that they saw in early November. It was actually November 15th. So part of what really mitigated things for the grain industry was the short crop. If this would have been a normal year, this would have been an incredible disaster for the grain industry, because essentially there's been virtually no grain or very, very little grain that's been able to move through the Port of Vancouver in the last 8 to 9 weeks. It's still very, very slow out there. And amazing as it is, the railways in a matter of about 10 to 15 days actually got their rail line put back together, and they were running trains by the beginning of December. But they're moving them a lot slower because they're going to have to wait till spring to complete that repair. You can see what happened with the unloads on the West Coast. Week 15 was the last normal week that we saw, and normal is all relative. The blue line on this graph basically represents what the 3-year average is for unloads on the West Coast. And you can already see that what the impact of the short crop has done for the volume that's running through the Port of Vancouver, as well as in Prince Rupert. The red line is Prince Rupert, the blue bars and the blue line is Vancouver. But as soon as that rainstorm hit, everything just pretty much died out. And we had a little bit of a flurry of activity there right before Christmas, but the Christmas rush came on. And ever since then, we haven't seen much in the way of unloads. A normal week in Vancouver in a normal year would be about anywhere between 5,000 and 6,000 cars unloaded every week. We haven't been seeing much more than about 1,000 in Vancouver. So even with the short crop, we should be seeing 2,000 to 3,000 cars a week. We're not. And what's been happening is that grain companies have been putting off sales. They've been deferring sales, trying to push them back further into the year. And this is kind of the effect of what that flooding had on the system. Conversely, we started off this year with a pretty slow vessel lineup. Again, the blue and the red bars basically show what the total West Coast vessel lineup would be in a normal year, the 3-year average. What we started to see this year is that vessel lineup starting to get up close to where the 3-year average would be. And that's just not right given the size of the crop. And so we've got some vessels that are still sitting out there that, again, as I mentioned earlier, have been waiting for grain for over 40 days. And that's problematic because that vessel demurrage will clock and it will have ultimately that cost come back to the producer in some way, shape, or form. Again, you can also see what's happening with the vessel lineup. And what we do is we track not just grain vessels. We want to see what the other commodity groups are doing by comparison. And you can see that the grain vessels, they've been spending, on average between 15 and 20 days in port, which is not what we would consider normal for the situation that we've got. But as bad as the grain industry has got it, when you look at what the other types of vessels are doing, it's considerably greater. And you can see it in this graph as well. Normal for the Port of Vancouver would be to see anywhere between 45 and 50 vessels waiting out in port. As soon as the occurrence happened on November 15th, we started to see that number grow. And as of this morning, and this graph doesn't reflect it, but as of this morning, there was still 78 vessels out there. So it's going to be a while before this gets cleaned up. There are, the grain vessels are just a minor portion of it. The container vessels out there, there's 15 there this morning. Normally they should have 5 or 6. And there's over 45 other bulk vessels waiting, which is predominantly coal and sulfur and potash. So there's issues out there. So in summary, we just went through a record year in movement, and we're going to be followed by an almost record low movement. Not a volume that we've seen since 2002. And the floods are going to continue to plague us for probably another month or maybe even 6 weeks before some semblance of normal comes back to the system. And I would be remiss if I didn't mention that there's going to be some other challenges in this coming year. There are capital projects that were on the books to fix some of the congestion issues, in particular in Vancouver, that we're going to allow for increased throughput capacity. They're not moving along so quick. So as we all hope that this crop is going to, the 2022 crop is going to be back to something akin to normal, Not having that capacity in place could pose some problems going forward. I don't think that the anchorage issue on the West Coast is going to go away anytime soon. It's going to be a sore spot for us as we move forward. And I think that any opportunity that your folks have got to ask questions of some of the people in power, the politicians, grain companies, railways, and the ports. Be sure to ask them, what are they doing to make sure that we have an adequate amount of capacity to make sure that when things get back to normal, our problems don't become critical again, as they did in 1920 and as they did in 2013-14. At that point in time, that's my presentation. I'd be happy to take any questions. I'm not sure how you want to manage that, whether you want to do it through the chat or whether you want to ask questions off the floor. I turn it back to the folks there.
Jim's got a question here.
104. A few years ago, Neptune were planning a big expansion at Prince Rupert, which would probably solve some of the anchorage problems at Vancouver. Is there any chance they might revive some of those programs?
To the best of my knowledge, no, they've backed away from that. You're thinking about the Campotex expansion for a potash terminal up there? Is that what you're referring to?
Yes.
Yeah, no, as far as I know, that's at the very least on the back burner. And to the best of my knowledge, there hasn't been much talk about it. Now, it could get revived, but I think that what's happened in the meantime is that Neptune has spent about $500 million expanding their facility at Neptune on the North Shore, with the expectation that they're going to move a lot more volume through there, both coal and potash.
Thank you.
Good, Wayne.
Wayne Bacon, RM 430. The question I have for you is, I'm part of a short line, and right now we're running about 55 cars behind. Like the cars that should have came in week 24 are coming in week 26, supposed to be, and not saying they're going to get them. And week 25 is also pushed up to the week 26. So I was just wondering, with the problems they're having out in Vancouver, because all our basically cars go to Cedar Rapids because they're mostly filled with oats or that type of commodity that is moving south, and it usually goes through Winnipeg and down south. But why is there a shortage of cars, or why is CN not supplying the cars?
Good question. And I've had a couple of conversations with the railways about this, and a lot of it has to do with the cold snap that we just went through. But part of it also actually kind of goes back to what happened on the West Coast. You know, they've just gone from one problem to the next. I'm probably the last person who would be defending the railways, but I do have, as a former railroader, I have some sensitivity to what it's like trying to run a railway in -35 weather. They were having some real serious issues with trying to keep air in trains. They weren't, CN was very fortunate in they didn't have some of the derailments that CP did because of the cold weather, but all the same, it really slows things down. And that was just compounded by the issues that they had for, since the middle of November in the Lower Mainland, where they're very reliant on having that big portion of their movements cycle back into the country. So it makes it difficult for them to try and get capacity to spot back into the country. And a third thing that's compounding that is and it's not unlike any other operating company in the business today, in the environment that we are. They've had their issues with COVID, and their ranks are depleted. Now, one question that I asked straight up was, is that, tell me you don't have people on layoff right now? And they emphatically point out that they've called everybody off their furlough boards and the layoffs, and they're using management personnel to run trains, doing the best that they can. And I think the expectation is it's going to be, as I said, another 4 to 5 weeks before something akin to normal starts to come back. And that's barring any other calamity that might be in front of us, like another 2 or 3 week stretch of absurdly cold weather.
Norm?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Norm Hall, 277. Mark, with the weather issues, with the flood issues going into Vancouver, have any of the companies moved anything up to Prince Rupert, as we see PR numbers are down in the recent times?
Yeah, hi, Norm. Wish I was there, actually. I should have mentioned that up front. I wish I could have made it down there, but between airlines and stuff going on here, it was best. About Prince Rupert, there was actually 4 vessels that were actually taken off the Vancouver lineup and moved up to Prince Rupert, and they've been looking to fill those things up now. Ocean vessels aren't like taxi cabs. If you make a decision that you're going to shift it from one origin to another, there's quite a bit of logistics that go on to doing that. But between 2 of the grain companies, they actually moved 4 vessels up to Prince Rupert. And that's probably as much as they could have handled at this point in time. Because bear in mind that if you're going to originate grain and send it through Prince Rupert, it's only served by one railway. And if your grain that you want to put onto that vessels is got to be sourced, it's got to be sourced from CN origins, which also means that you've got to get cars from CN. And so that, the logistics of that don't get done overnight. And that was part of their issue. The other part of the issue up there is that when the railway makes their plan to how much volume they're going to move up there, they do it with the anticipation that they're going to move X number of trains over a period of time, which means that they have to staff all of the locations for crew changes, et cetera, and for the maintenance of the equipment, et cetera, all along up that line. And if they make a change or they want to increase their volume, it can't happen overnight, because they have to put that staff in position in all those locations, Prince George, Smithers, Terrace, and Prince Rupert. And it's not like you phone up somebody and say, I want a locomotive engineer to move from Kamloops or Vancouver up to Smithers, BC. That's a process that takes sometimes as long as 6 or 8 months, because you have to train them on that territory. They can't just hop into a locomotive and drive away. They have to have a training period. They have to have an association with the track, et cetera, et cetera. They have to understand the territory that they're running on. So it doesn't happen overnight. And so, but I think CN did a pretty good job of trying to get things together, especially in face of all of the stuff that was going on, including the cold weather that we just went through.
First of all, do you know of any examples of dispatch paid in the last 5 years on grain? And also,
Actually, yeah, I was surprised. Our annual report will be coming out in a few weeks, and there was a fair bit of dispatch paid in Vancouver. Now, that was in last crop year, and that they, especially towards the end of the crop year where they were actually, the railways were moving things in on time. They were turning around vessels pretty fast. And the dispatch number, and I won't tell you what it is, but it's a lot higher than I thought it would be.
And an unfair question to you, any guess on what the demurrage might be for this crop year?
For this crop year, it's going to be high. No, we don't officially publish a dispatch number or a demurrage number until the end of the crop year, but I can tell you that there's been serious 8 figures in the last month and a half. I'll leave it at that.
Todd?
Whoops. Hi, Mark. Todd Lewis here.
Hi, Todd.
Hi. You can tell you used to work for the railroad with that last answer, so that's good. Yeah.
What?
But good work. I think as we go forward, especially on the loop track. Are you seeing? I realize that the G3 loop track has had a big impact, obviously, with those numbers you're showing, and so have you got a split like how the in-country loop tracks, how much they've affected things? Is that, I know that's probably combined, but is it 50-50 or what would the, as we see terminals in country, that's something, we can really push for as producers. Why don't the terminals have more loop tracks in country?
There's a whole bunch of reasons, but I'll give you a few. One is sunk cost. A lot of those, a lot of the concrete elevators that you see out there today, they were built with the idea that they were going to last for 40 or 50 years. Now, some of them have come up with ways to kind of make a pseudo loop track. Viterra has probably about 4 facilities in Saskatchewan. Can't name them off the top of my head, but what they've done is they've lengthened out the ladder track to the point where it's 134 cars and they can actually operate it as a pseudo loop track. There's other companies that have tried to look at their facilities that they've got where they you essentially need a whole quarter section to build a loop track in order to do it effectively. And sometimes that property just isn't available. Either the geography doesn't allow it or the ownership of the adjacent property makes it nearly impossible. I would say though, Todd, that any new facility that gets built from now going forward is going to be a loop track. Period, end of story. But that's not going to make all of those high throughput elevators that we saw built in the 1980s and 90s and even earlier this decade. They're not going away anytime soon. The grain companies are going to keep running those things. They're going to try and do it as efficiently as they possibly can. They'll probably, look to buy property or make deals with the railway so that they can make longer tracks and actually run them at 134 cars. But insofar as a real drastic change, I think it's going to take probably about the same length of time as it did to move from conventional to high throughput. And I think we're looking at, things that are going to happen progressively over the next 10 to 15 years.
Okay, that's it. Anybody on the computer, Brenda? Nope, obviously not. Everybody know what time we got there doing? Almost 5 o'clock. It's almost adjournment time. Go ahead. Brenda's got something. Yeah. Can you go online there, Mark, and see that question
Oh, okay.
on the chat?
The question is, so the grain industry is doing their part via grain loops and new cars to increase railways efficiency. Why is the railway not doing their part in improving the efficiency or desire to haul grain? Just really quickly, of those 6,000 cars, the vast majority of them belong to the railways. They're the ones who went out and they bought the cars. Yes, the grain companies have bought them. In particular, Grains Connect and G3 has bought a lot of cars, but nothing compared to what the railways have done insofar as doing that. As to the rest of the question, that's a really good one, and I can't answer it. I would probably refer back to my earlier point about, there's lots of things that they could do insofar as increasing the overall car cycle and the transit time, and that leaves us very concerned as to their performance. And I think it has a lot to do with the fact that when it comes to grain, there's no easy way to phrase this, or diplomatic way to phrase it, but grain is one of those commodities that they know that if they don't move it today, they're going to move it tomorrow or next month or 3 months from now, because there really isn't any other way to get it to port. So it isn't really a competitive commodity for them. They're going to get it whether they move it now or later. Now you juxtapose that against their intermodal traffic. Intermodal traffic, for instance, is very, very competitive, highly competitive. And it's not just between CN and CP, it's between the ports. So if they don't move it out of Vancouver or they don't move it out of Prince Rupert, the shipping lines could very easily say, and they do, well, we're just going to move that over to LA Long Beach or another port. Now, this is a bad year to use that as an example, but in a normal time, they can actually do that. So, that's the disadvantage that the grain industry has got when it comes to dealing with the railways. I don't know, I hope that answers the question. It's probably not the answer you wanted.
Well, thanks, Mark.
Okay, I
Always
appreciate
it.
Thanks again. I appreciate the opportunity, and again, I wish I could have been there in person.
Next year.
Hopefully, yeah. Okay, thanks, folks. Be safe.